We live in an evil world. A world full of pain, suffering, tragedy, depression, fear, and death. Some of the images we've just seen are representative of the most tragic and horrific events of the last century. Some of them masterminded and carried out by utterly evil people. Are we any different than them? What is it that makes the difference between an Adolf Hitler and a Nelson Mandela? What is it that makes the difference between a Margaret Sanger and a Mother Teresa? What is it that made the difference between the men of Gibeah in Judges chapter 19 and Boaz in Ruth chapter 3? They were all from the same tribe, Benjamin. They were all Israelites, those who were supposed to be God's people. Yet they couldn't have been more different. Day and night, dark and light, good and evil. What made the difference? The men of Gibeah are so bad that not only did I have to leave out the last part of the chapter, but they're so bad that the author of Judges has to once again open that chapter with the reminder. Now, in those days, Israel had no king. In other words, there was no moral leader in the land. The people had rejected the only moral leader Israel had had up to that point. And now everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes. And what seemed right to the men of Gibeah was to act exactly like the men of Sodom and Gomorrah. Except in that story, the men were never able to actually carry out their plans. Angels from heaven intervened, and the next morning, the two cities were destroyed. God gets a lot of flack for that story. But don't you wish the angels had intervened in Gibeah? But there was to be no rescue this time. The men of Gibeah did what seemed right to them. The Levite afterwards responded by doing what seemed right to him. And the whole thing ignited a civil war in Israel that all but decimated the tribe of Benjamin. How could God's own people have sunk so low? How could they have reached this point of unspeakable depravity? And just when we're beginning to wonder if all hope was lost for the Israelites, along comes the book of Ruth. And despite the title of the book belonging to the heroine of the story, I think the most tremendous character in the story is the hero, Boaz. During the harvest season, he had gotten to know the widow, Ruth, as she gleaned in his fields. He was a distant relative, and according to the cultural customs in Israel, he was in a position to take Ruth in marriage and further the family line of her father-in-law, Elimelech. But he doesn't assert this right. Instead, he lets her glean in his fields and even makes provisions so it's easier for her to do so. Eventually, Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor at night to present herself as available to Boaz and see what will happen. Now, this seems very odd to us, and while it was very bold, Ruth wasn't offering herself up in any sort of immoral way. But she was throwing herself completely into the control of Boaz, submitting herself in this unorthodox way, And you can only imagine that what happened next will be completely determined by the kind of man Boaz is. It's the middle of the night. Nobody knows Ruth is there. And quite frankly, she's there because she's in need. She's vulnerable, defenseless. What will Boaz do? He could have abused her, taken advantage of her, but he didn't do that. And not only did he not do that, he even sheltered her from the appearance of impropriety. Verse 14. So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until the morning, but she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other. For Boaz had said, "No one must know that a woman was here at the threshing floor." And he sent her away with a bundle of food and a promise to make wedding plans. What a stunning difference between Boaz and the evil men of Gibeah. That group of men went trolling around the town looking for someone to take advantage of. Boaz, on the other hand, refused to take advantage of Ruth, even though she had placed herself in a precarious position. He sheltered and protected her, both by treating her with honor and respect, and also by making sure nobody would have the occasion to start spreading rumors about her. Not only was Boaz not going to take advantage of Ruth himself, but he was even jealous for her reputation. So what made the difference? I think the key is really in verse 12. Boaz said, "That while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there is another man who is more closely related to you than I am." I can see the question in your mind. What does that have to do with anything? I'm one of your family redeemers, but there's someone more closely related than I am. What does that mean? It means Boaz was very familiar with the intricate details of tribes and families and family lines and how they were to be cared for. Details laid out in all the laws God gave to Moses. Boaz knew how he was related. He knew of the obligation of a relative to carry on the family line of one who was deceased. But he also knew that according to this law, there was someone else who was considered a closer relative than he was and consequently would have the right of first refusal, so to speak. And the only way Boaz could know all of this is because he'd obviously spent a lot of time becoming acquainted with the law and as a result, the God who had given that law. In this godless, lawless land, which is what the nation of Israel had become, here was a man who could have been called a man after God's own heart. Someone who wouldn't take advantage of others for his own personal gain. Someone who was kind and generous to the poor and needy. Someone who would rather die than exploit a vulnerable person or cheat in a business deal. How is it possible that this man lived at the time when Israel had no king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes? Because no matter who we are or where we live, and no matter how wicked the culture we live in, we all have a choice about who we will be as individuals. There is no such thing as collective salvation or collective damnation. Every individual will have to give an account of himself to God, and nobody else can make that choice of character for us. And that character is shaped by worship. What we choose to worship will ultimately shape our characters. If we worship God and follow His ways, we will develop one sort of character, the kind of character Boaz had. And if we worship self and follow our own ways, we will develop another sort of character, the kind of character displayed by the men in Gibeah. Boaz actually did what was right precisely because he wasn't doing what seemed right in his own eyes. He was doing what God said was right in his eyes. And look at where those two paths lead. One to love and life, the other to misery and death. It really struck me as I was preparing this message, the irony of it all. That Christianity today and the Bible we revere as sacred, particularly these Old Testament stories, these have somehow become associated in our culture with the denigration of women. As in, a lot of people think that God is in favor of subjugating and devaluing women. That boggles my mind. Because I look at these two stories and I think, who is it that devalues and abuses the woman? It's the people who don't have anything to do with God. It's the people who are doing whatever they want. Boaz, on the other hand, whose heart is sold out to God, shelters and protects and cares for Ruth, this vulnerable creature who places herself totally in his control. Don't you wish the world was filled with men like Boaz? How much better would this world be if all the men were sold out to God? I wish, for the sake of my daughters, that there were more Boazes in this world. But I'm afraid our world today is not much different than the nation of Israel in the time of the Judges. There are Boazes out there, of course there are, but I think they're far outnumbered by the men of Gibeah. And let's not kid ourselves. There are only these two groups. There are only the Boazes and the men of Gibeah. There are only those who worship God and those who worship self. There are only those who would never take advantage of the vulnerable, no matter the situation, and those who won't hesitate when the opportunity presents itself. There are only these two groups. And submission to God is the only thing that makes the difference in the heart. Without God in his life, Boaz would eventually become one of the men of Gibeah. And so would we. Without God, we're never more than a few steps away from becoming another Hitler. Oh, there might be some people who think they can be good without a God, as the slogan of the American Humanist Association goes. But that's a lie. If the self isn't surrendered to the Savior, it's only a matter of time before the right convergence of circumstances brings a person to the point where they will have to choose between self-advancement or self-preservation and the needs of another human being. And putting the needs of another human being above your own needs is something the heart can only learn from God. Only He can bring out the best in us. Only He can take a man of Gibeah and turn him into a Boaz.